Well, thank you everyone for your patience. We're going to go ahead and get started. So once again, thanks for taking the time to join us on your very busy Tuesday, heading into a holiday weekend with quarter end and year end, I imagine, for some of you folks. So today's webinar is Data Mapping Without the Headache, Strategies for Success, presented by Tevora and Security AI. I'm Kevin Cutter, a Cybersecurity and Compliance Advisor for the Tevora Information Security Management Consultancy. A bit about Tevora: it's a pure focus to cybersecurity, over 7 dedicated practices made up of risk, compliance, threat, cloud, incident response, solutions, and data privacy. These practices support several hundred services. Privacy: I'd like to share that Tevora has provided GDPR services for many years and has prepped for California Consumer Privacy Act, better known as CCPA services, since the legislation was first announced. I'm joined today by Jeremiah Sahlberg, Tevora's Managing Director of our federal and third-party vendor risk practices. Christina Whiting, our Principal of PERC, Privacy, Enterprise Risk, and Cybersecurity Framework Compliance, was originally scheduled to present, but as all of you know, in information security, emergencies can arise, so she was called away. But will make herself available, as will Jeremiah, for any questions or requests that you may have following this presentation. Jeremiah's primary role is to assist our clients in aligning their security and third-party risk and privacy programs with their business strategic objectives. Jeremiah has over 20 years of experience in the security and risk spaces. He helps organizations design, establish, and mature their privacy and security programs and capitalize on efficiency. Jeremiah also mentors junior consultants, manages client relationships, assists with pre-sales and post-sale activities, and oversees all projects from inception to the closeout presentation, ensuring that every Tevora deliverable exceeds client expectations. Partnering with Tevora today is Security AI and Greg Martin. Security AI is an innovator of AI-powered cybersecurity and data protection infrastructure. Its product suite, Privacy, is the world's first privacy ops platform that helps automate all major functions needed for privacy compliance in one place. Greg Martin has an extensive background in both cybersecurity and data-centric technologies, as he has over 10 years experience architecting and deploying data loss prevention programs and supporting technologies for some of the world's largest enterprises. He leverages his background in data protection and cloud computing to architect privacy ops solutions for global enterprise customers. Know that we're taking questions throughout this webinar. You're encouraged to ask away. These will be addressed at the end of our joint presentation. With that said, I'd like to turn this over to Jeremiah and to Greg.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate it. And thank you to all of our attendees that have taken time out of their busy schedules to spend a few minutes with us to talk about data mapping. Maybe it's something that's a little bit of a new topic for you. Maybe it's something that you've been tasked with or something that you've been working on for quite some time. But we'll talk through what that process looks like and some strategies to help make that process a little bit easier. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Jeremiah Sahlberg. I am the Managing Director of both the federal and third-party risk practice areas, but do have an extensive background in cybersecurity and related fields, including privacy activities. With me today, we've got Greg Martin. I'm going to turn over to him for just a brief moment, then I will kick in and talk through our agenda here for the next, I think we've got an hour slated. And then what we'll do is I'll start with the presentation for the first couple slides, and then we'll get into a really interesting interactive session here with Greg to talk about some of the tools out there to certainly make the job easier. So Greg, maybe you can say hello for a couple moments.
Yep, thanks, Jeremiah. So again, this is Greg Martin. I'm a solutions architect with Security.ai. So I come from that background of data protection, data encryption. So it's been an interesting transition over my last year of my career into privacy, because I have really the security background, and now I'm looking at everything through a different lens, really looking through the lens of, how do I protect my data in the rights of consumers and employees. So I hope to take you along this journey and really build on what Jeremiah shows you and show you how we can automate this data mapping and the ongoing maintenance of these data maps. So here, I'll hand it back to Jeremiah, and we'll take you through this journey.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Greg. So what are we going to cover today? Probably the very first thing here is just to get aligned on some terminology. Definitely, folks have heard the, what data inventory, data mapping, data process inventories. What does that all mean? So we'll spend a moment or two talking about, just level setting on some terms. And then when you actually want to start this process, you're certainly going to have to involve different key stakeholders across your organization. So we'll help identify some of those that maybe are already on your list. Maybe it's a few new folks that you should consider as including this process as you go down this journey. Certainly, when you're collecting this information, there's certainly going to be challenges along the way. You'll talk to different folks and you'll hear different stories. And how do you deconflict that and come up with your data map for your organization? Next, we'll talk about certain resources that are available to help help your visibility and understanding what the data flow is and how to maintain that over time. So, and Greg will have a nice little demo for us as we get into that. Certainly, please use the GoToWebinar Q&A function in there. Kevin will be monitoring that for any questions that pop up. And with that, if we can go ahead and jump into what's the difference between data inventory and data mapping. So data inventory, if you think about it, a data inventory is, think about a spreadsheet. What are the different types of data that's inside of your organization? Sure, that's a very important piece of information to know so that you can, eventually figure out what happens with it. But a data map helps tell a story. So the data map is more than just that data inventory, but it's really, how does that information get into your organization? Where does it flow? How long do you retain it for? What's the retention parameters? So when you think of data inventory, think of, it's a spreadsheet. These are the types of PII or other information that's being housed within your websites, your partners. But when you think about a data map, think of something that's really going to tell a story. Much like when you're a kid and you have a treasure map, it tells a story how to get from here to there and what happens when you get to that endpoint. So data map is that more inclusive overall understanding of what happens with the data that's inventoried across your organization. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So whether or not you're being asked to do this for the first time or something that you've already done, how do you start this particular process? And there's a couple different approaches. Certainly, there's some manual methods. You have to have interviews and maybe conduct some surveys. A lot of the practices that we work with, we'll start with questionnaires. It's, hey, let's collect some initial information so that we can figure out where data is within the organization. Ultimately, you want to leverage some tools to help facilitate an automation where feasible to help fill in the holes. But certainly, if you're looking at who are your key stakeholders for conducting a data map, you have to pick the right folks across the organization. We all know who the database administrators are. Those are the ones that are in there, seeing the data down at the column and row level within these, the warehouses of information. So they're certainly a key person that you want to include in your surveys. Data custodians, those that are in the IT space, they're responsible for making sure that the data is properly stored, access to the data is maintained. Those that are, you've got a data lake out there, someone's managing that big unstructured data. They may know what's inside that data lake, so certainly you're going to want to bring them to bear. Data analysts, we work with a lot of organizations that have a lot of big data, and they deal with analyzing that information to pull out what's meaningful from their business. But when you're also, those are the same people that are going to know what kind of information is inside those data lakes as they're doing their analytics. So they'll certainly be a key stakeholder to bring along. So some developers, they're the ones who write the software that interfaces for accessing that data. They're a key stakeholder here. Those that put the systems together, the system architects, they're also a rich place to collect data from. And then even out there on the product side, you've got, you're stepping up a level. They're the ones who understand what the services that are being provided, what the products are, and they're certainly going to know how that data is used, maybe monetized. So they're going to be an important stakeholder in understanding where that data is within your organization. I wouldn't discount the marketing folks. Certainly, that may be one of the same for smaller organizations, but the marketing teams will have an idea of where that data is being pulled in from. If you're putting marketing campaigns out there to get a broader blast of your products and services, you're collecting that information either from the websites, through other email campaigns that have been driven that collected information. So certainly they're going to be an important stakeholder here. And then as well as those power users, those that are administrators, even those in HR and legal that handle information, they're going to be folks you want to bring to the game. So maybe these are some of the folks that you've had part of the interview process before. Maybe some of these are some new faces. But so you're going to ask questions. You're going to have these interviews, and what's going to be interesting is you'll want to ask the same question over and over, because it's really interesting. You'll get different answers. One of the important things here that we typically find in doing these assessments is in siloed environments. You may ask a data analyst, where's the data stored? Oh, this is where it's stored. But if you ask someone else, that data is also shared, replicated out into a cloud environment or somewhere else. So you want to make sure you understand where that data is and asking those questions to those key stakeholders. Certainly when you talk about, okay, so you've had those interviews, but there can be some automation that can be pulled into play as well. What you want to do is to run some tools. And security AI is a great example of something we'll see a little bit later on today's session. But once you've identified certain data elements, you can say, okay, hey, go search that information, go search that drive, search that database, go look for some of this type of information within that source data. So we'll certainly start to see how that technology can facilitate the truth telling around what we learned in some of those interviews and manual scoping processes. Greg, if we can flip to the next slide. So just like in grade school, we're talking about a data map. We're trying to tell a story here. And one of the key components of telling a story is those 5 W's and an H, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So those are the key things to look at when you're building that data map and telling that story around that information. So certainly, what is the type of data? You should have that from your data inventory to be able to pull into bear, hey, I think we're collecting this type of information, so now you define what that is. Next thing you want to say is who has access to it, or probably more importantly, who should have access to it, but certainly you want to have the right kind of access controls around it from a security perspective, but at least to define those roles and responsibilities of the who within doing your data mapping processes. Next, how is that data initially collected? There's got to be some origin point of the process where data enters your environment. Likely it's going to be maybe on a website, maybe someone logs in, there's an IP address, there's a registration process. Maybe it's being pulled in through emails that are being sent to an organization. Maybe it's a sign-up process. Maybe it's a gaming console that some miner's using out there to log into a game. That becomes the origin point for a particular data piece. So certainly, how is that data initially being ingested into the organization? Once that data is ingested, now you have to be a good custodian of that information and understand where that data is being stored along its journey. Sure, it comes initially in through this website. That website then puts it into a database. That database may back it up to somewhere else. Hey, you've got some replication services that are putting it into maybe an AWS or cloud storage place. So where is that data stored during its life cycle within the organization? With any of the privacy regulations, certainly GDPR and CCPA, there has to be an understanding of why. Why is that data being collected? What's the intent behind it? There has to be, and within those regulations, a defined purpose. Maybe it's analytics, maybe it's something else, but there has to be that particular why is it there. Once you have the why, then probably the next most important thing is to understand how long do you need to retain that data for. There are certain organizations that, not particularly in the privacy space, but taking an analogy here, if you're building parts for, let's say, Boeing, a 747, you have to maintain product information for the life of that aircraft, which could be 50 years. Now, in the privacy world, that may not be the case. You may not need it. In some cases, you have to have the right to be forgotten. So you have to have a place to understand when does that data retention end, what's required for your services, but where does that exit point when the data needs to be retired. So once you've identified all that information, the who, what, when, why, where, and how of the data, to make sure that you understand what your trend and usage of that data is. So certainly, how the data is processed within your organization will evolve over time, and how your business processes that information will evolve over time. So what you need to do is look at it and trend and say, hey, if we're going to evolve our service, if we're changing our service going forward, how does that affect the data collection process, how does that affect our data mapping requirements, and how do we keep that up to date? That's one of the things that we'll talk about here as part of the management monitoring. Can we go ahead to the next slide there, Greg? So certainly, as we kind of talk about the story of the data lifecycle becomes a very germane topic of, the data is then created, stored, processed, and so forth. So what we've got up on the screen is certainly the ISO 38505 data lifecycle management. There's also the COBIT version, I think there's COBIT 5, where you have, the data comes in, how do you store, process? Very similar model here with COBIT. They do a little bit more upfront on the planning, design, build, acquire the data, but really, how is it used? How do you monitor that? And ultimately, at the end of this process, how do you delete or dispose of that data at the end of its data retention period? Next slide, please. So defining journeys. Journeys is, and if maybe some of you are familiar with what journeys are, maybe this is a new terminology for some. Journeys are really a graphical way to represent a process. It actually has its roots back in the UI or the user experience or the UX software development process. Show me the consumer journey as you're building out software, but that has a very similar and equally as important process in the data mapping world. So as you go to map out your data, by creating a journey or a visual description of how that information is processed within your organization, a picture tells 1,000 words. So putting together these journeys or stories visually will help explain what's happening. So what we've got here, I apologize for the small tightness of the picture here, but ultimately within that first swim lane is your personal data. Where's that origin point? How are you collecting it from the consumer? And that collection method may come through a variety of different ways, whether or not it's a web form, an email, phone, maybe it's a transaction on a point of sale terminal or something else. So that collection method is then, okay, I'm taking that information, where is it going? It's going to some sort of database, data storage. Maybe it's within your own infrastructure, maybe it's in a cloud service. Maybe it's even in a partner, a Salesforce and AWS that's out there. So, but taking the time to create these journeys that help tell this particular story will help paint a better picture. Certainly, how do you then use that data for onward communications, particularly from a marketing perspective? How am I taking that information and reaching back out to my consumers? How long am I storing it? And then certainly, a lot of organizations, they build their solutions on top of third parties, and there will be a need to leverage those third parties and share information with those third parties to effectively deploy your service or solution. So certainly being aware of any recipients that you're sharing that information with and flowing down the expectations that you have as an organization to those partners. We've talked about this from a consumer perspective, but we can create the exact same journey for employees. What's the employee's journey for accessing that data? Maybe they come into a contact from a contact center. Maybe they're coming into it from an analytics perspective, but certainly creating that same level of that same journey illustration, if you would, of that data flow. Something to be aware of is certainly when we're dealing with minors, I think the age is a little bit different for GDPR versus CCPA, but understanding how data is processed for minors, how they interact with that data is certainly something that's really important to call out as part of your data mapping exercises as well. Go to the next slide. So what's our methodology here? How do we help our customers go through this? And it's really through this well-defined 4-phase process. We're going to start with doing some discovery, connecting those initial analyses, having conversations, and there's initial key stakeholders across the organization, creating those questionnaires and pushing those questionnaires out to those key stakeholders so we can figure out where's the data, what type of data do you have access to. But this is also where you want to start identify which tools and repositories that you have, so you got the right kind of tools to search those repositories. Validation, this is probably the most important phase. So I can't tell you, as someone who's done security assessments and audits and interviews with clients for decades, you can ask that same question to 3 different people, and guess what? You're gonna get 3 different answers. And it's not that they're lying, it's just in organizations that have well-defined silos of how information is being processed, you want to make sure they're going to answer it how they see is what they see. But that's why you have to ask that question to different people to really see, oh, it doesn't just go into this database. Oh, there's this backup we're putting, you know, somewhere else. Hey, we're using this AWS S3 to replicate our backups. Oh, now it's in the cloud environment. So having that validation and asking those questions or having those questionnaires to multiple people is a good way to tease out what the full picture is. And that's where you kind of deconflict it. Hey, oh, we're using this tool, we're searching this archive, we see this information there, then, oh, we now need to know that the data is in this particular drive or database or what have you. Certainly when it comes to governing your information, you know, now you're getting into the process of how do I do the ongoing management? You know, certainly wherever you can define the policy, policies must be defined, but wherever you can create tags and additional metadata around the information so that you can figure out how the data is flowing in and out of through its life cycle is certainly important to do. Additionally, you want to make sure that you have the right kind of capabilities within your organization to govern and update those policies as your data evolves. One of the reasons why we've partnered here with Security AI today, and this is because you've built out this data map, you've gone through this process, you've built questionnaires, you've interviewed folks, you've got something in place. But how do you keep it up to date? How do you monitor that information? How do you automatically update that data map? Well, this is where some tools and technology and automation comes into play. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg to kind of talk a little bit about what's next.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Again, this is Greg Martin with Security AI. So now I want to take things to the next level. And as Jeremiah said, you know, I want to show you how I can use our Security AI platform to not only help build that initial data map, but help you with the ongoing maintenance, help you and actually utilize that data map for more than just a regulatory checkbox and just saying that, hey, I mapped my data and I understand where it is. Because once you built that data map in the proper format, it should be able to trickle down and allow you to actually understand, hey, what are my risks based on this map? And when this map changes, what are my inherent, and then as well as how do I use this data map to help fulfill the actual data subject rights of my consumers and employees. So really, our methodology a combined methodology will help you actually address all of those issues without having to reinvent the wheel every time for each part of your security privacy program. So it all begins with, you still need to go through this phase of, hey, you need to understand that tribal knowledge and gather the tribal knowledge from your actual, say, your subject matter experts. So those DBAs, those project leaders, application owners, marketing, you're still going to need to gather that and populate some of that information from all those assets. So you still need to build your asset list from a repository. But with our platform, we want you to help automate that process by either connecting to, say, an asset management system or a CMDB, some sort of system of authority that we're able to ingest some information from. And then what we can also do is help you gather the information to help build the processes. So build the flows and understand the interconnectivity between those assets. And then from there, what we'll do is automatically generate the regulatory reports that are necessary. So that will automatically populate your Article 30 report, help you populate any data subject rights when you have to fulfill those. You'll be able to attach all of the processing records here. But then what we can do is take it to another phase and say, hey, let's layer on technology to help automate the discovery of data and both validate what you've gathered through your manual methods, but also find new things. So update and constantly validate, hey, here is the data types, here are the number of identities stored in this asset. And then what that's going to allow you to do is have a constantly maintained Article 30 or data map report. And then what it's also going to allow you to do is periodically reassess yourself and see what your privacy impact is based on those changes to the data that's stored in those systems. And then what that can do is also trickle down and help you manage, hey, as I'm recognizing these new risks due to data changes, how do I know if I'm improving my risk posture, if I accept this or defer this risk? So what we do is give you a whole workbench where you can actually manage those risks and figure out what types of remediation you should do. And then somewhat as a byproduct of this, what you're doing is helping fulfill your actual data subject rights fulfillment. So when requests come in with a real-time updated data map, that means you know exactly what repositories to search in. And since our tool's already connected to those repositories, identifying what personal data lives there, now we can help you fulfill those data subject rights requests without having to involve another system performing another scan. So what I'm going to do here on the next few slides, I'll break down each of these 5 sections here, and then I'll circle back and tell you how this all plays together, how it all flows, and how you would actually implement this. So like I said, how this begins is just like Jeremiah said, it's really gathering that initial information about your data assets. So that sounds like a simple thing, but when you think about it, if you need to attack hundreds of assets, contacting hundreds of different subject matter experts, that's a really hard task to just manage that if you're doing it via spreadsheets. So what we do is we want you to be able to pull in that list of assets. And one, you should pull it in through an authoritative source. So that way you can ideally get constantly updated. So your privacy team will automatically know when new assets get added to your network. So you can automatically pull those in. Then what you can do is start to invite those subject matter experts to the portal to help fill in those assets. And you can do this either via survey, so you can send out traditional survey, they can answer the questions, get that back, or you can invite them right into the portal and have them fill out the questions live right inside the assets that they own. But what we also do is we understand that there's inevitably going to be questions. All these experts, they're not going to be privacy experts. They're going to need clarification on what type of data is considered personal, what type of information you're looking for in certain questions. So we give you a collaboration interface throughout our entire portal where you can ask questions back and forth, so your privacy team can actually update people and not have to do all of this activity via email. Then the next phase is now that you have your assets kind of inventoried and the details about those assets, now we need to gather the information about how you're processing the data. So here's that exact flow that Jeremiah said, hey, I need to understand what's the source of the data where it got ingested in, what data elements do you think are part of this, where does it actually get stored on the back end, and then does this go down to another downstream application, and then what's the retention requirements on that application. So again, in the same way, we can pull all this data in via survey or via collaboration directly in the portal. And again, you want to actually collaborate with those subject matter experts and explain this, because these are very detailed questions. So they will need to explain to users what exactly you mean by the transfer method, or what a controller versus a sub-processor is, so you can clarify all of those questions right inside the interface. And then your output from this, you can just immediately export, say, hey, I need to get my compliance report to the auditor. So again, you can just generate this from all of those details. But what I still consider this a draft type of records of processing, because it's a simple point in time. It will show your cross-border transfer and what data locations you have data located, but in general, it's still just going to be a point in time. Unless you go back and refresh this, contact all of your subject matter experts once a year or once every 6 months, your data map is constantly going to be out of date. And really, what we also find is it's still technically a draft mode, because that input by your data asset owners and process owners, it may not be entirely accurate. Like Jeremiah pointed out, you have the issues where everybody's opinion is different, or they might just not realize what data is in their application. Or maybe at the deployment time, it contained a certain application, but over time, you're going to have data change. You're going to have different data elements get stored into an application. The resonancies of the data subjects that are inside an application can change. You might have an application that's employee only at first, then slowly morphs into a customer-facing application, and now that can entirely change the way you have to treat privacy with respect to that application. And then what we'll also see is that data retention can change, and that can have lots of trickle-down effects where you're not adhering to your retention policies. And then in the end, your IT infrastructure is going to be constantly changing. Every IT infrastructure changes, spins up new assets, and now that we're in the cloud generation, you can all of a sudden have servers hosted out of another AWS region overnight and not realize, and if you're not watching that, you could have all of a sudden a massive, cross-border transfer of data that you didn't realize. And then in the end, that manual data map isn't really going to help you. It's not a real mapping of an individual's data back to where their data lives. So it's not really going to help you fulfill a DSR all that much. So what we've really concluded is that, hey, in order to make this data map a real data map, it's something that I can use for constant risk management and DSR discovery, I need to be utilizing something that's doing active scanning and discovery all of the time so I can keep up. Because in the end, what we've realized is that, hey, a manual data map, it's not a real data map. It's because data is a living organism. It's constantly changing, and you need some sort of automatic scanning and map in order to keep that map up to date. Because something that's done manually, it's inherently going to be stale and inaccurate, and in the end, that makes it just incomplete, which will result in risk where you could have a massive gap in time between a previous assessment of what was in a data set, and then a year later, if you could have a year gap in time if your assessments are a year apart. And during that time, all you're doing is accepting the risk that you have that data. And then what we also see is that hey, a traditional data classification, so a data classification system where you're just throwing things into very high level buckets, it's not the type of graphing that we're doing. So what we build with our system is an actual people data graph, which is a mapping between user identities and the actual data across all of your systems. When you're talking about, say, a data classification system, all you're doing is tagging a piece of a file and saying, hey, this contains confidential or sensitive data. It's not telling you whose data it is, might not tell you if it's an employee or a customer. So it really it serves limited purpose when it comes down to privacy. So what we want to do is actually build an automated data discovery system. And what we're doing is building this people data graph by connecting into all of your different systems, and then actually building a map. And we're identifying the personal data elements that we're finding. Then we're mapping it back to a user. And what that allows us to do is say, all right, well, what's the residency of this user? Let's store that as metadata. Let's also store the metadata about what type of user is it? Is it a customer? Is it an employee? And then all the metrics about, hey, how many files did I find this same piece of data in? And when I say we're connecting into systems, we can literally connect into things like your on-premise applications, your databases, your file servers, even your next generation SaaS installations, and then all of your infrastructure as a service up in AWS and Azure. And basically connecting into all those points, performing this data mapping, and then what we can do is utilize this both for that DSR fulfillment and building this people data graph, which allows us to really update and push all this information into your data maps. So those same assets that you have as part of your data maps, we can connect into those, identify what personal data is in there, tell you exactly, and then pull all that metadata and stuff it into your data map. So now you have this rich data map where you accurately know exactly what personal data elements are in these applications, whether it's customer information, whether it's employee information. So now you can trust that your data map is actually up to date and accurate. And it's all made possible by this fact that we're doing a link back to the actual identity of who owns the data, not just identifying that, hey, this file contains a social security number. We need to track it back to say, hey, this file contains John Smith's social security number, and I also found that same social in another file. So it's all very important, and it ties into all of these aspects of privacy. And now once you have all that information, so now I have a nice populated data map with the latest information about what data is stored in each of these applications. Now what can I do with that? Well, now I can watch what data elements are stored in these applications over time, and now set rules to say, hey, if I'm all of a sudden seeing this application store twice as many identities, or all of a sudden this application is starting to store credit card numbers, now I can trigger actual privacy impact assessments based on those changes, because it's those changes that are the important part. When you want to actually flag and say, hey, all of a sudden this set contains credit cards, well, now I need to run a new impact assessment. I need to reevaluate what other applications does this application connect to? Maybe what's the retention on this? I might need to update that. So these could all be massive risks based on that data change. But again, if you weren't doing automatic scanning, you would never know that data changed until you did your reassessment, re-interviewed the data owner, and maybe they would tell you that, oh yes, we had a project and we're storing new data. So this is very critical to be able to detect these changes and then be able to reassess what the impact of that is in privacy. Because that could be an inherent risk. So then how do I manage all of these risks? I'm going to be running all these impact assessments, and now I need to manage and understand, well, I can't remediate all of these risks. I need to understand what risks are worth accepting, which ones are going to have the least impact, and how do I track this over time? So what we can do is roll up all of those risks from your impact assessments in interviews and other assessments, and actually just roll that up into a risk framework. So basically a workbench where I can track and say, hey, I'm tracking these remediations, I'm seeing that affect my risk over time, and it's all populated and made possible by the fact we're doing that automated scanning behind the scenes. So now we know that this is based on actuals. This isn't based on suspicions that that an application contains data. It's based on actual data. So how does this all fit together? Those are the individual pieces, but how we see this as an entire program, we'd see, again, start with that sync and that import of your initial data asset catalog. And some people already have this done. Some people might have already done this once with an existing data map, so we can import that either way. But ideally, you want to have an ongoing feed, so you're automatically told, hey, a new asset just popped on the network, we need to assess it. And then what you would do is start to gather the details of those data assets. Again, by inviting people to the portal and either fill it out directly in the interface or via survey. And then gather, again, that details of processing. So how is the data coming into that system? Where does it flow out to? And all the details around that. And then what that allows you to do is keep your Article 30 report, your data map up to date. But then what we want to do is start to layer on, hey, once I have that map, I need to actually understand, well, what's the risks of the way I have my data flowing. So again, that's where you can send your impact assessments out, get your understanding of what my impact assessment is on each asset, as well as each process flow, and then manage those risks in my workbench, understand which ones should be accepted, which ones should be deferred, which ones should be actioned on. And then at any time, so right at the beginning of the process, you could have enabled data scanning and helped with the fulfillment of this from the start, or we can come in after the fact and perform the validation phase. It's up to you. It's a very flexible deployment, but the benefits of performing that scanning is that you don't have to trust, it's less work for the actual subject matter experts to have to fill out. You can just tell them, hey, we actually found all of this data in your application. Do you want to clean it up first, or do you want to accept this risk and move on with the evaluation? Up to you to take that stance. But then once we've actually populated all of this, you won't have to worry about downstream fulfilling those DSRs, because since we've performed that automatic data linking and understand exactly where every piece of user's data lives on your network, that means say a data subject comes in and requests a copy of all their data, or requests to be deleted, or requests to have something changed, we have the connections to make all of those changes, all of those queries, pull the data or delete the data, and send back all the information to the user, all through a secure portal. Now, if you didn't have that secure portal front end, you'd be doing all of this manually. You'd be emailing out probably to all 100 of your subject matter experts, asking them to look for this user's data. And that entire time, you're just sprawling that poor data subject's information through your email system, trying to gather up that data. So here, we're making it so much easier for each of those for each of those subject matter experts, as well as the privacy experts, so you don't have to do all of these processes manually. And now what we actually see from that is a massive ROI on a system like this. Since it's so integrated into each piece, and each piece of our platform plays off of each other, it inherently just has a huge cost savings by just automating a lot of the manual processes that surround privacy. And then what that really translates down to adhere to all of these DSR requests very quickly. You're able to find your risks and your data risks based on where your data is located. You're able to reduce that risk right up front and avoid those financial penalties from non-compliance. And then what I also see is when you're able to provide a seamless user experience for a data subject or even an ex-employee when they come to exercise their rights, that right there goes a long way to help and reduce that brand loss. If you have a disgruntled customer coming in and submitting a data subject request, if you're able to provide a response that's nicely formatted immediately back to them, that usually can turn around somebody and actually help with your brand image right from the start. So that's about all I had today. Jeremiah, did you have any other closing words?
Yeah, let's turn over to Kevin. Actually, so thank you very much, Greg. That was fantastic. Before we get into this, maybe we can back up one slide for just a second. And really, were there any questions that came in there, Kevin?
Yeah, there were a few actually, so I'd be happy to kind of share them. It seems based off the question structures, a few of them would be Tevora facing, a few would be security AI facing. So one of the main Tevora questions to me, how do we map our data with our SaaS vendors?
Say one more time, how do we map data with our SaaS?
Yeah, how do we map our data with our SaaS, software as a service vendors? Oh,
gotcha. Yeah, that's a really good question. From the perspective of you're bringing on or sharing information with any of your third parties, and think about your third parties, you're certainly thinking about your SaaS partners that you're leveraging and SaaS vendors. One of the very first things you're going to do is make sure that you've done a data protection impact assessment, or DPIA, or data privacy assessment. There's a couple different terms there, but as part of your onboarding, you'll certainly want to make sure you're doing a vetting process. There's information that you're going to natively share with that particular vendor, but there's also data that they may be collecting from the end consumer as a part of that service. So you're going to want to tease that out. And that's why that third-party review process is so important as you are beginning a relationship with any of your vendors. So certainly do that. And then it's not a one and done type activity. You want to understand what your vendors are doing for you over a period of time. And so certainly having a reoccurring evaluation, maybe it's annually, maybe it's a little bit more often, but you'll want to conduct those DPIAs, those data privacy and protection impact assessments, and retain them so that you understand and can feed that into your overall data mapping process. So hopefully that answered that question. If for some reason this question wasn't answered fully by whoever asked it, please do not hesitate to reach out to us and we'll get you some more information on our thoughts.
Great, thank you, Jeremiah. And now a question for Greg in Security AI. How do you calculate risk in your tool?
Yeah, so risk is going to be based on a few things. So you would actually help define, hey, what's your company's posture towards risk? So you would help adjust and say, hey, social security numbers, say, are super sensitive to us, or we're more concerned about customer data. We're more sensitive to having data stored in certain countries. So you would help define those headings, and then we would adapt the actual risk score to what your personal settings are. And really what you'd be looking for is tracking your risk over time. So you're seeing, like, as you're gaining more data, is my risk going up, or is my risk actually changing? So it's really your risk deltas that become the most important piece.
Excellent. And then another follow-up question, is there a data modification? How is that information logged? Can we trace that change?
Yeah, so when we're seeing, so say we have an asset that all of a sudden went from having 5 data attributes stored in it to 6 data attributes. We'll maintain a history of, hey, exactly when that, when you started storing an additional data attribute. So say you started storing credit card numbers. So you'll have a version history for each of those assets. So you'll be able to see, hey, at this point, my risk changed, and now it's because of this actual delta. So that is definitely important. You'd still need to go back into that application and say, hey, we need to tie this to an actual change control where somebody all of a sudden started using that application differently. But at least we can help you pinpoint that point in time when it changed.
Excellent. And then another question: what is the technology behind mapping an individual's data? Are you copying any data?
Yeah, so good question. So the way we're doing our data mapping back to an individual is we're learning the actual structure of your databases and your unstructured data sets. But what we're doing is taking one-way hashes of any of the pieces of personal information we find, and then we're performing the linking based on that. And our linking is based on our proprietary kind of data analytics and data science platform to actually perform the linking back to original identities. But the key is, we're not making copies of the data. We're taking a hash of, say, just somebody's phone number, storing a one-way hash of that, so I can then link that when I find that phone number in another location.